Hello, ducklings. Welcome to episode 11 of Masks and Mimicry. As always, it's Brand and I
Hello.
here to talk about Vampire the Masquerade, creating a character in Vampire the Masquerade specifically. And as it is part 2 of our creating a character in Vampire the Masquerade series, which will be 3 parts, just like our previous D&D series was. We're going to talk today about human backstories and touchstones as an element of those backstories. In our last episode, we talked about character concepts, where they come from, how we create some. And today, we're going to go more in depth into the background of your characters, specifically the human background, who and what they were before becoming kindred of the night.
Important element.
A little bit, and it's something that's easy to gloss over, unfortunately. Especially for people that are newer to Vampire, because you don't want to talk about humans. You're playing it to play a vampire.
Right.
You don't want to spend too much time thinking about humans and human stuff.
It's usually not something you experience as part of the gameplay unless you're starting at that point and going through that process. But you're usually starting as a vampire, so it's more of a hindsight backstory thing.
So I wanted to start with something a little bit more experiential, based on some of our experiences and stuff. If you have played VTM, what was the human backstory of your last character?
Oh man, what was
At least
my
in
last character?
general terms. Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while. I want to say it was our forum-based one for while we were waiting on a certain project that didn't happen. In which case I actually linked to that character. It was a Toreador musician who kind of ran a nightclub, and I actually based him off of being sired by a previous character that we played from different Dark Ages campaign, who's also a Toreador and a musician.
For me, I think my last character was actually in a forum based RP, different one, forum based Vampire the Masquerade game that I played, and he was in the human backstory, going beyond the his experience as a vampire. It was something of a business person who's trying to be on kind of the leading edge of culture and tech. But I wanted to play someone who was... He was a Ventru. He was going to be a Ventru. But the concept I had was for someone who was like a literal cleaner, a literal cleanup man, and wasn't really like the super suave, high tier business person. You always make like the CEO of the company and stuff. I didn't want to play someone who was really quite at that level, but someone who had was really more like the mid tier business person, but had struggled and worked a lot to get to where they were. And it was someone who was trying to be kind of a leading edge of culture and tech in garbage. Is essentially investing in renewable like landfills and recycling. Someone trying to maintain like this positive presentation in society and in culture, wanting their business, to have a sort of a cultural edge where people would reflect on them positively because, recycling and all of that. Not someone who necessarily supremely cares about that as much as he cares about his image. And so it was really based on someone who really kind of got into that and got that foundation as a mortal. Someone who was, kind of like the middle child and found an unusual way to try to kind of stand out and pursue prosperity, constantly looking for a certain degree of positive regard from society, from people, and ended up really getting pulled into more of a relationship with like a um, almost more organized crime element once they got to the vampire aspect, which completely kind of shifted things because part of their humanish background was a prolonged tenure as another vampire's ghoul. Basically, a very long a period as their servant, um, which led to them having done some rather bad things before they were ever a vampire. Because
Yeah.
got to do whatever they tell you to do.
For sure. I'll be quick with just my human element of my last character. There's not much to expand upon. Toreador, first and foremost, as a vampire clan, are very keen on drawing in people talented in the arts, whether it's music or painting, the arts
Yeah.
in general. And my character was a student at Juilliard back in the day and had a rival with other students, one in particular, and we were actually both being groomed to compete against each other to decide who would be unknowingly the one turned by the essentially the professor at Juilliard, who was in fact a Toreador. So just kind of building up this rivalry, musically speaking, unknowing that we would be turned at some point, depending on who won this competition.
Yeah, when you're creating your character backstory, I think, I mean, everyone has their own process for creating a character, and everyone, I think, develops the process that works for them. And for me, I always start with the character concept. I always start with and that's why this series, the first part was concept and then backstory, because that, in my mind, is how I go through the character creation process. I start with a vision of what the character is that I want to play. Not thoroughly detailed out, just like we discussed in the last episode, very very kind of vague in general terms, and then I stop it. I go, okay, that's a thing, and then I go back and start creating the backstory for this character. I don't work backwards. I kind of make that, and then I jump all the way back to the beginning. Um, and so I just kind of wanted to see like what your starting method is. Like, how do you navigate
Yeah.
starting that portion of kind of creating your backstory?
We talked about this for D&D as well, and I think you and I ended up doing the kind of the reverse of each other. It's probably still the same for this, although in my last couple of characters, both being Toreador, uh, I naturally gravitated towards music as an aspect to touch upon, and because I enjoy music, I play music as a hobby.
Mm-hmm.
So it just kind of started there as like I want to be a musician first and foremost, and then look at the times. What time period are we playing in? What are the possibilities, and kind of work backwards from how I would portray that.
Now I have some resources. I don't usually bring show and tell and resources to this podcast, but I brought some this time. This first one, sorry, is a useful list of concept ideas for Vampire the Masquerade. And I'm not really going to go into it as much as I just wanted to provide it for people. It is, I think, pretty handy when you're trying to come up with a concept for characters to help you brainstorm what that character might look like in that initial phase. At least for me, sometimes if I don't already have an idea, it's good to find a list of things and just kind of pour into it and see what comes up. And so that kind of leads into the next question, which is, where do you get interesting backstory ideas for your vampires?
I draw heavily from anime when it comes to, strangely, just for Vampire the Masquerade. I don't do that so much for D&D. And I think that's probably because there's a little bit more of a realistic tie there. A lot of anime exists in the real world as far as the setting goes. And some of it plays heavily on kind of darker nature things. Certain ones, at least, that you can really find inspiration from.
Yeah. Sarah mentioned music as something that often gives good inspiration for character ideas, and I can agree. I've certainly gotten some character ideas from that, especially some of the concepts. But delving into the backstory, like the actual human background for a vampire, sometimes music still helps with that. But I usually kind of detach those. I usually use that as like a mechanism for the concept of what the character is I want to play. And then when I start thinking about background, I start thinking about people. Um, something in my throat here. I start thinking about people I know, people I've seen, people I've heard about, because you're really talking about just realistic people and different situations, and sometimes you tweak them into realms that are perhaps archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it often comes into is you start looking at different character or human archetypes. The suave businessman, the angry activist, that one guy in school who just naturally succeeds at everything without trying.
Right.
You look at real people, including some that you've seen in movies or something, archetypes that come up in stories. Um, but I think that tends to be more helpful for this part rather than looking at like vampire movies, for instance. With character
Right.
concepts,
For
I think
sure.
looking at movies, at vampire movies and stuff, could be super good for coming up with an idea of like what's the vampire I want to play. But when you go back to the human before that, because they're not vampires yet. And outside of creating the concept, I generally, for the most part, try not to touch what the vampire is until I've got that human backstory.
Yeah.
Like I create the concept and then I go, okay, that's great. Now let's do this. And I can't
Yeah.
say it's super clean because sometimes there is a little bit of back and forth. But
If you look at like historical figures in the world, dating as far back as whatever you feel like going to, all the way back to Roman days, or even further beyond, just historical people personified either in television or just in books. You can ask yourself, imagine if that person was a vampire, strip that portion from them first and kind of focus in on the human aspect. But vampires set, historically speaking, where a lot of the people that are famous in the world were probably vampires to an extent, influential, um, and just hiding it. So if you
or
think about
controlled
them
by vampires.
or controlled, so yeah, so if you think about them as being somehow tied to the vampire element and then remove that, you can focus in on those historical people and draw reference from them.
And I think one of the important things I always remember with vampire is it's supposed to be a tale of personal horror. And so that means that your character, your human backstory for your character, oftentimes is going to be very different than the vampire you're playing. Even though they tend to be young, you tend to play neonates, you tend to play kindred who've only been turned for a couple of years, and so they're still very human. But critical and important life events change people, and what can be more life changing than being turned into a bloodthirsty monster?
Yeah.
So at the very least you got that. You in some ways you are no longer the human that you were before, and in some ways that should probably bother you.
Yeah. And with it, the turning comes a amount of power. Um, and you can look at people in powerful positions historically as well, and strip them of that power and look at how did they get there, to look at like the human aspects of maybe where they started from to the point where they got
Yeah.
power, and like that moment they got that power, associate that with now they're vampires, and then look at everything prior to that.
So let's talk about actually building the backstory. When you want to actually delve into it and start adding some details, adding some information of different types. I feel like a good approach, and I feel like this is pretty common for all games because there's lots of templates for these everywhere, is to think of which questions are important for your character and for fleshing them out and to answer them. Remembering it's your human backstory, not the vampire backstory necessarily. I mean, kind of is, but you know.
You can kind of know where you're going, but focus on the getting there rather than past that point.
Yeah, and I think it's always more interesting when it's a curvy road to get there. You know, it's not linear. You don't go, I want to play a crazed anarchist vampire, and so obviously it was going to be like kind of unhinged as a human and very perhaps a very militant sort of protester, very militant activist, not even like a very tame one, just, very leads right up into that. And I think it's much more interesting when you make it curvy. You know, it's like, okay, maybe you want it to be close, so maybe they used to be a very proactive and very sensible activist who organized events and helped to really make useful contributions. But then somewhere along the lines, they became violent, even, or perhaps something about becoming a vampire. They kind of lost some degree of control over certain things, and so perhaps they're Bruja. They now have some anger to deal with, so that
Yeah.
makes it difficult to be as productive and logical about these things, and more difficult to organize them sometimes. Or you can make it really wonky and have their human side have been very different, as long as you build in those reasons um, why things started to shift.
Yeah. There should definitely be bridges between those points that you can very clearly see how it went from point A to point B, no matter how wide
Yeah.
or weird it is.
Yeah, because you're essentially describing what will become your vampire, not necessarily what is your vampire. So, I do want to ask, well, what are your top questions? I kind of have mine already unfairly listed in my notes, which you don't have the
Indeed.
benefit of. But what are some of your top questions when you're creating a backstory that you want to answer?
For vampires specifically, I focus a lot on time period, and I'll probably keep bringing that up. That influences so much, and
It
especially the
does.
where you're playing. Those two things. So once I have that information provided by the DM, typically the where and rough year, as far as like you can be kind of creative with that yourself. You're not necessarily given the year for your human element. You're kind of given
Hmm.
the year of your playtime. So you can go back as little or as far as you want. But you pick a year and you look at the things going on around you. And I'll start asking myself, what are some of the more like pop culture things happening at that time frame? Who are the most important people, the influencers of the time? And start asking myself, like, how do I fit in with this society? What am I doing? What type of day-to-day activities am I part of, if any, and start looking at just like the modern routine of a human being during that time frame, just all the questions associated with that.
Aside from spammers in chat, it has become a much more prominent problem of late. And unfortunately, it is not terribly quick process to ban them. There we go. Done and done. So, sorry, it took me a minute.
Yeah, it's not like specific questions, but like a category of questions all
Mhm.
pertaining to that element is where I'd start.
Let's see. I have another document. I actually prepared a document because for some reason I had a difficult time finding a list, like a questionnaire for this, for Vampire the Masquerade. There certainly used to be some, but I had difficulty finding one I
Probably, yeah.
liked. So I made one myself. And I'll add this when this is uploaded to YouTube. I'll add it under resources, of kind of like my top background questions that I would use, generally speaking. And, I think I'm not going to go through all of them, but kind of my top ones are, what was their childhood like? What environment did they grow up in? What impact did that have on them? What do they value? Who do they value? Or whom do they value? And what do they believe in? That's like, I really do take put a lot of stock into childhood, and perhaps that's because of all the psychology classes I took in in college. I minored in psych, so I tend to really label out those relationships and look at them a lot, and go and look at the both the environment and the nurturing element of things, and go, okay, what was their family situation, what was their relationship with their parents, with their siblings, did they have siblings, what kind of economic status were they in, where were they, and what time period were they in,
Yeah.
because culturally it's very important, were they in a middle class Caucasian household, because that sort of thing is going to, as we know, drastically going to change the sort of experience they have in different areas.
Sure.
And I don't necessarily always go super in-depth detailing all of those, but those are the kind of questions I start looking at to get a good idea and go, okay, what was their experience? What sort of family or support did they have or not have? What was their educational experience? Were they good in certain subjects? And I really prefer open-ended questions for a lot of these, because I like things that are going to require not a short answer, but just sitting down and kind of brainstorming, because that's really what it is. It's more fuel for you to brainstorm and go, what was their family life like?
Yeah.
Okay. Was it good? Was it bad? And start kind of working that stuff out. There are some things that are really super finite and detailed. You have to figure out, like, how old are they? What year were they born in? And that informs some other stuff. Like,
and some people, go ahead.
Critical events that happened based on when they were born.
Yeah. I know some people, and I'll do this sometimes, is I'll ask myself like a scenario question. Like, if you were walking down the street and someone pulled a knife on you, what is your reaction at age 16? Theoretical questions of a scenario, and you kind of think about the mental response to it to kind of inform a little bit of, okay, yeah, would I run? Would I, try to suddenly go into fight mode and, and that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I do think that's something that people don't consider sometimes is what their character's disposition was at different points in their backstory. Because again, you shift, you change, you evolve, and in many tabletop games, going this much into like childhood and stuff is very not necessary. Like D&D, sure, having a general idea of their how they grew up is good, and can be important, but you don't usually need a detailed, layered approach to it. But Vampire is a very different game where it is immensely story focused, and some of those
Super
background
social.
elements can definitely come up in the game. So having some ideas for some of them, and especially, I think two groups of things. One being events, critical events in your character's life. When did they first fall in love? Does that matter to them anymore? Does it still kind of sting? Because they're a human being. Do they have a rival from their mortal life that they still hate? Do they have important events that happened? They got arrested one time. Are there critical things that happened that changed their behavior?
Yeah, mind shifting things. They can be typically, as not as impactful, or they can be very, very like borderline PTSD impactful if you want to go that route. And a lot of people, unfortunately, have kind of experience on their own end with some of those things that they don't have to search too far to find, and they utilize those. Be careful doing that, but but it is a thing. You can go pretty light or pretty heavy into those moments.
Yeah, and people often do play to their strengths, and their own experiences. And sometimes your experiences are negative ones, but you can still put those into characters if it's something you want to explore. Now, the other area and kind of our last thing to really delve into and explore are touchstones. That is the important people and well, mainly people from your
People and
character's
things.
backstory. You know, they're your important people, your family, your friends, possibly even enemies,
Your dog.
your
Yeah.
pets.
Yeah.
I don't. You don't have to go. You don't have to list every single person that was ever important to your character. But you know, there are some different things that you can look at. You know, you can look at an enemy, a rival, a grudge, um, best friend, former best friend, you know, lovers, siblings, parents, children.
Yeah. Possible.
Any of those that are relevant, you should at least have a general idea of what and who they are, and depending on when they were important, and if they're still important, you know that affects things for your character. Because if they're from like your childhood, well, they may not still be important anymore, but they may have changed. You know, that
Yeah.
may be something you add that changes how your character develops. But mostly when we talk about touchstones, we're talking about things that are still relevant for your vampire character. Things that even though you're a vampire now, well, your parents are still alive. How do you feel about that?
Right. And you can kind of break all of your touchstones down into categories of, growth as a human. We go through phases, as kids to then early teens, hitting your preteens, and then into teens, and then into, almost, young adults. And each of those can
Mm-hmm.
be broken down into have different touchstones, and some touchstones that exist through all those phases. And you can kind of ask yourself, are there people from this phase still in my life? If yes, keep using them. If no, then good for a mention for why they're important to you for that time period, but not relevant to you going forward.
And there's, I think I kind of forgot what I was going to say there from what was I going to say?
People, touchstones.
Yeah, people and touchdowns. I want to play vampire. I also want to play vampire. I always want to play vampire. Um, but I do think that's one thing that can be difficult for people who come from like Dungeons and Dragons is this idea of building touchstones into the game yourself and keeping them somewhat relevant. Um, and not for everybody that comes from D&D, of course, but for people who, you know, like mostly focus on the mechanics and the combative side of D&D, because adding backstory characters is a risk. You know, especially in a game like Vampire, these are people who very much might come into play and very well might be used against you in varying ways. But that's something you can think about. Like, are these people still important to your character? Sure. But then, great. Then you could take a look at different things you can do. For instance, if we take LA by Night, which is a currently paused, but especially if I'm running the game, your backstory will be used against you. But um, like LA by Night was is currently paused. Twitch streaming vampire game, and there's two characters in there whose mortal touchstones very much come up very often. One has children from their mortal life and really tries to separate those from the kindred life, tries to keep them completely separate, does not want anyone to know they have children, does not want their children to know anything about vampires and the world of darkness and all of that, because people will kill them, yo.
Yeah.
And so, to the degree that that person's children kind of hate him because he's never there. You know, he keeps a distance. He keeps them separated. Still talks to them somewhat. They know he's around. He sends money, that kind of thing. But they're like, you know, adult children, and there's no real contact there because contact would put them at risk. Whereas there's another character that has important mortal connections and like lovers and can't let them go, and is just like, no, I gotta have them. I can't let them go. I gotta still have them in my life, which immediately becomes a problem because then you're like, well,
Yeah.
how do you protect them from other people finding out about them and using them to hurt you? And
And
so,
then, like, are you trying to also protect them from learning about the society behind the screen?
yeah, there's a it gives you a lot of fuel for different kinds of drama, and that's really what Vampire is all about. In the end, it's about drama, and enjoying just telling a dramatic tale. And so it gives you a lot of fuel for different things you can explore. It makes you vulnerable, but as we discussed in the in the last episode, there's no you don't win Vampire. You just tell a good story. You kind of can win D&D. You get lots of gold.
Kind
You
of
become
the
important.
goal. Yeah.
You defeat you win battles and stuff. You kind of
Be the
win.
hero.
You never really win Vampire. You just kind of survive it for a while and tell a good story.
Your
Um,
reward is you live another day and can come back next session.
yeah, and sometimes you cry, and sometimes you do have a victory, and sometimes you just have fun
Yeah.
trying to keep going on. And those touchstones, I guess my point is they add a lot of fuel for that because you can one, it gives you a thing to worry about. You're like, oh god, someone's gonna find out that I have a sister. Um, but also, yeah, it gives you things you can think about, like, oh, one of your character's goals. That's part of our next episode is talking about goals. Part of your character's goals might be keeping other people from knowing about your touchstones or your family or whatever. And you can be like, no, I gotta keep them separated. I gotta make sure nobody knows about them. Um, or even supporting them. Maybe you have kids and you have to somehow support them while also protecting them.
Yeah. And you can, when you're coming up with these connections and touchstones, you can even go so far as to think about their own feelings towards a potential, future turning situation. Like, what are your, if you have a sister, what do you think your sister's reaction would be if this happened and knew about it? And, all those kind of questions, like how they might view you and how you would react to that potential worry.
And also, how do you deal with age? Your character
Yeah.
doesn't age, and years are ticking by, and the people that were important to them are getting older. And how do you deal with that? What does it do to you? It's rough. Um, so, my last question that I want to talk about was what's your favorite sort of touchstone to use? Like, do you have a favorite type of, I always like to have a character with like a sibling that they care about or something. What do you think is the most fun to use and exploit, even if you don't always use it? It's just really kind of compelling.
I would like to do a sibling kind of touchstone, or maybe a best friend. I've don't really go that route. I've typically just kind of followed through the parent thing, because
Mm.
everyone has parents. That's a given. Whether they're alive or not at the moment, not a given, but everyone has parents, um, and it's easy to use. So I've kind of gone the easy route almost every single time. But I would like to very much utilize probably a best friend situation in a future setting.
And that's actually a good point. Even if you have a touchstone, someone who's very important to your family, or not your family, but to your character, um, but they're dead, that doesn't mean it won't affect them. That could still be something that your character dwells on, something that affects them. Maybe you became a kindred, and a few years later, your mother died or something, and now it still bothers you because you weren't there or whatever. Um, Let's see. The Man with No Screen Name. I don't know why, but the aging thing reminded me of Bicentennial Man's titular character grappling with that. I don't think I've ever seen that movie, actually. I remember I
It's
started
been a
watching
long
it a
time since
very
I have.
long time ago, but I don't remember. I don't think I've actually seen it all the way through. Um, hmm. So you may have to explain that because I don't get it. I can say for me, and again, all of our questions are for chat as well. So if you have kind of a favorite that you like to play with or you would like to, I have not used this one as much, but I need to at some point because I love the juiciness of it. the potential for it, and that is having a touchstone that's an enemy. Someone from your past who did you wrong, and you can't get over it. You just, you're a vampire now. You should be beyond this. You have other more important things to worry about, but you really hate that person. and and now you can do something about it in theory. And that's kind of becomes a question of like, do you? Are you that petty that now you hate that person and now you can exact revenge in some fashion? Are you going to? How do you go about it? Or does someone else find out that you have this enemy and just to annoy you, they turn them and you're like, I really just furious forever now. Um,
Yeah.
I think can fit in a similar vein is a lover. Um, not exactly the same, but getting turned and you have someone that your character is in love with, and what do you do with that? And I have kind of used that one before in our Dark Ages game. It was not the typical sort of like vampire, but has to deal with a mortal person that they're in love with, who's none the wiser or anything. It was very much like they, because especially because it was Dark Ages, they knew what he was because they were basically like a servant of his sire's, and his sire knew about them and found it hilarious and would basically actively use the two of them against each other just constantly, just to be malicious.
That's funny. We're not going to get into these in this discussion, but there's a thing of flaws and merits in the vampire verse that I feel can, if you kind of work backwards from them, as you're not talking about vampire just yet, humans, having touchstones and a multitude of touchstones, a variety, can certainly help influence certain flaw manifestations you get through becoming a vampire, as a lot of them are vampire related. Like you obtain these in the process.
Yeah.
And it's good to think about them, your touchstones, as flaws as well, that you can kind of transition over if you're looking to connect it to the mechanical kind of point buy system that flaws and merits give you.
And in some cases, the flaws and merits are directly tied to touchstones. There's a few of them that are very much keyed into them, and that is part of our topic for next episode.
Yes.
So we'll have to try to remember to discuss that, because order of how you apply those may vary, because flaws and merits are usually a thing that I add at the absolute end. They can inform, I will say, they can inform character backstory some. Because sometimes I'll go to add them at the end and then go, oh, that's a good idea, and then go and change something and go like, oh, that gives me a thought. And that's a thing that I would add. I mentioned earlier that like I'll create a concept and then I kind of just go, okay, leave the vampire alone and come up here and play with my backstory. But I do go back and forth some, and because I don't think you should try to like hyper fixate on one thing and go like, I know I must do the human backstory, because sometimes I'll start working on something and then that gives me an idea for something with the character concept or something, and I'll go and write it down real quick. I just try not to completely derail and then start working on it. I'll just be like, oh, what about this, and write it down real quick and then go back.
Yeah, and in the case with flaws and merits, and we'll get into it next discussion, it sounds like there are things that are just universally like, this is something your character has dealt with forever, and there are some that are very specific to, this is a vampire specific flaw that you wouldn't have had while you're thinking about your human side, but you can think about some of the other stuff at the same time.
Let's see, the man with no screen name explained in the movie, it's driven home hard for Robin Williams' character that he has seen 3 generations of the family he's served come and go, especially in between letting Sam Neill's daughter go and finding the granddaughter. Basically, on a long enough time scale, individual human lives seem pretty fleeting, and they do. And That's definitely an element of vampire. I mean, usually in vampire, not always, but usually you're playing a neonate. So you're someone who's been a vampire for 2, 3, 5 years, maybe a few more than that. Sometimes you play older kindred, but usually you're not quite on the scale yet of having seen those lives become fleeting and meaningless, um, or maybe not meaningless, but becoming quite so quick. But on the other side, you have to start dealing with it. You have to
Yeah.
start seeing it unfold before your eyes as they start to age and you're not. And then in some cases, like my character I mentioned that was kind of like the garbage man who owned landfills and stuff. Um, it was somebody who was a ghoul for like 15 years. So as a ghoul, you still don't age. You're not a vampire, but you're also not human and you don't age. So he basically was somebody's servant for like 15 years while all of his family and friends grew older. And so he's in that case he did have some of that prolonged experience with some of those things where that made him a little bit more detached from the connection to humanity because he'd been in service to vampires for so long.
That about sums up Keanu Reeves.
Just witnessing the passage of
Doesn't, yeah,
centuries of
does not
mankind.
age. Him and Paul Rudd.
Yeah. Yeah. And Taliesin, yeah. Just time goes on and he does not age. So yeah, so were there any other things about backstories that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, the touchstones are the huge part, especially when you're dealing with such a human social game like
Yeah.
Vampire. And really, you're just preparing yourself to have that moment. Some of your touchstones you're thinking about on the human side can certainly start to integrate even before you've become a vampire into vampire society, because something has to happen for you to turn. And
Yeah.
usually, not always, but usually that thing is a slight buildup. There's a noticeable aspect that if you were to look back over like the last year prior to being turned, you can probably start to see some connections that you had missed initially that was leading you down this path.
Yeah. And there are some elements in the game mechanics and stuff that will allow you to keep some of those touchstones and things relevant intentionally. You can have there are some background traits you can have, such as contacts, where maybe an old friend of yours who was a really close friend is also good in accounting or something and becomes a contact that you can reach out to for help and information in that area. Um, and so you can actually tie some of those into your current gameplay, which kind of makes it more risky for them because you're
Mm-hmm.
actively bringing them in yourself. But it gives you there are some avenues I think where you can do more with them than just put them in the background. Usually, I mean, most of them are going to be in the background until the storyteller brings them up or something, or someone else does, or you actively engage with them in some fashion. But there are some systems and stuff that can come up like flaws and things, but also like the contacts and elements like that might
Yeah.
especially if you're playing a game in the same place your character was a human.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times people will make a character and then be like, oh, they traveled to a new town as a kindred. Um, if it's possible, I like to make a vampire character that's actually turned in the place where we're playing, because it does give a lot of potential for
You
some
to
of that
visit your
backstory to come up.
backstory more frequently, yeah. Um, and then just like a general statement, the more you flesh out about your human self, the more you can transition it to the vampire self and bring to the table to have a more enjoyable experience, I think, with everyone else playing as well. And to do that, you can certainly look at like current today world, and like how do you as a person feel about the things going on in the world, and then relate that to how would someone from your time period relate to the things going on in their world. Like if you hate this about current day, find a similarity to that existed back then, and like how would your character feel about that happening?
Yeah.
There's a lot of connection between now and perceivable 20 years ago, 30 years ago, wherever you're playing.
Absolutely. And that was one element we didn't get into too much is, I mean, we talked about culture, but when you're working on your backstory, looking at the time period and the area and looking at the culture of the time period, especially if you're playing a vampire that's a little bit from an older time period or something, is from 20, 30 years before modern, and who's maybe a little bit older than you are even, what was the culture like in that state or that country where they were from, and what type of events happened. Were there any ongoing wars? Were there any famines? Were there cultural revolutions? What
Major
went
political
on
shifts
that they were reacting to?
Yeah.
And so I guess that's pretty much it in 2 weeks, because again, we do this every other Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. In another 2 weeks, we will have the final episode in the series talking about flaws, goals, and character humanity. So that'll be it for today. But remember, if it's your sister, it's probably not a mimic.